I assume if you're sitting with somebody who knows me, they've already given you the keep your hands and arms inside the vehicle at all times. If you have a heart condition, make sure you have your medication on you. That's what I do. I've taught K-12. I've taught in urban and rural environments. I've taught in great schools and I've taught in terrible schools. I've worked with great leaders and I've worked with lousy leaders. And the more I've worked, now 20 years in the field of public education, I keep constantly coming back to this theme. So I'm thrilled that this is something that we're going to be able to talk about today. Before we get started, there are two things that we need to discuss. One of which is to be a professional education leader in the K-12 space, imagination is a required job skill. You have to be able to conceive of that which does not yet exist. If you exclusively concern yourself with what is, you will never help your students to get to what can be. That applies not only to student learning, but also the way we work generally in schools. So when you get to any part of what we're talking about today and go, either I don't get it or I don't see how, stop and remind yourself that imagination is required. It's literally one of the first things I say in my first book on education, in which I propose a new way of doing American public education. So we have to be imaginative in our work. And I'm operating under two primary premises. One, and I'm talking to professional educators here. I fully understand that if I were to have this conversation with a layperson stakeholder, I'd have to change my language, I'd have to lead them through several premises. I want us to skip to these two things. One is we serve children. We're here for children first, and everything in school should put them ahead of the needs of the adult. I operate on that premise. I also operate on the premise that learning is vastly more important than school. And if these two things equate at any point in your mind, I hope that if nothing else, we'll leave here recognizing that these two not only are not the same, but too frequently have absolutely nothing to do with one another. I hear all the time, we talk about collaboration a lot. I actually have a part of my school called the Collaboration Commons, and we're constantly talking about collaborating. Collaborating requires peers, people working together with equal amounts of power and equal amounts of influence, able to work together to come up with a solution. This is kind of the operating level we want our adults working at when they're working with each other. I acknowledge that that is a good thing, and I am not here to challenge that idea. That's why I put it up at the top in green. Here in the middle, though, cooperation, if you think about it, is different than collaboration. If I'm being a good leader, I, as a 12-month instructional administrator, I want to collaborate with my staff. I want to empower them, uplift them, and allow them to fly and do the things that they need to do. I do not want them to cooperate with me. Cooperation is what a dog does when you're taking it out in the yard. I don't want cooperation because cooperation implies subservience. I also don't want my students to cooperate with me. Cooperation, again, it implies subservience. I'm right, and you need to cooperate with me. If we're saying, well, that's not what I mean when I say cooperate, I mean working together, then you really mean collaboration. I'm going to use words today with specificity. I'm a little bit of a taxonomist when it comes to these things. I like to neologize, but there are good words that already mean what they mean. Service is where I want you to orient yourself as a teacher. Supplicate yourself before your children. We are not collaborating with our kids. We are not working as equals. We just had it as our first premise. They are more important than we are. Their needs must take priority in everything we do. When you heard students first, okay, that sounds good. Think about that. That means every one of their needs must come before every one of your needs. I want to live here today. I want to live in service to children, and I want everything about what we do to be in service to children. The school belongs to them. It's not for us. One of the things we do at Discovery every year is we have a promenade wall, and every kid signs the wall. It's like a chalk marker thing so that we can erase it and it moves on the next year. But we talk about identity and ownership, that this building belongs to you. It is a palace for children. I swear that in some society somewhere, if you translated the truly great school, it would translate to something like palace for children. We need to operate within a condition of service to children. And not just when it's convenient or as an idea. It has to be a pervasive philosophy and pedagogy at all times. If we accept the situation of children at the center of our praxis, if we accept that we serve children, that we are here to help them learn, we are here to help meet their needs, that we are responsible for children at the center, if we put them in the middle, all adult things have to be in one of these outer boundaries. My preferences, my comfort, my enjoyment at times. The things that, and I'm not suggesting that we don't need to be joyous in our work. I find it joyous to serve children. I'm not suggesting that your needs don't exist. But when it comes to what we're talking about today around prioritization, theirs have to consistently come first. It can't just be lip service. So my need to have a certain chair, that operates out here. They get their needs first. My need to have certain conditions, my desires around temperature, my beliefs and my predispositions, all of that has to take a back seat. My very first job, which did not end well, my very first job, I was in the hallway and we were having some kind of evacuation. I don't remember why. I'm from upstate New York, almost near Canada, and my first job was in that same area. So it snows like 9 months out of the year. It's really, really cold. We know from research that students, particularly teenagers, experience temperature differently than adults do. Now, I was only 22, so I'm not sure how much of an adult I was at the time. But I was responsible, and I see this teacher having this really negative, nasty interaction with this kid in the middle of the hallway. And she wants him to go to the locker and get his coat before they go outside for whatever this evacuation was. And he's like, I'm not hot, or I'm not cold, leave me alone. I'm fine. You can't go outside in that t-shirt. And I went over, I'm like, I'm the band director. I wear uniforms. I can take care of this mess. And I go over to the kid and I say, dude, what's the problem? He's like, I don't need a coat. Can we get out of here? I don't know what's going on. She's making this big production out of it. And she goes, all right, yeah, it's good, Mr. Reeves, you handle it. And I said, let me try this again. And I knelt down. I don't know what I was going to, I think I had some authoritarian thing, some stupid first-year teacher, moronic, I'm the boss mistake kind of thing. And I leaned down and I made eye contact with him. Why are we having this conversation? He's like, I don't know, man. That's what I've been telling her. You're fine, right? Let's just go outside. What are we even doing right now? We had this moment where he's like, I don't know, why are you all like that? I don't want to be like that. He's like, then don't. Can we go? Yes. Yes, we can. Where are you going without your coat? Mr. Reeves said I could. Like I said, this first job did not end well. But we had that moment of clarity where I realized that what the heck am I doing imposing my preconceptions about cold and hot? It's your body. It's your clothing. It's your choice. Well, you're going to catch cold. First of all, that's not how germs work. But it's not my body. What was I doing in that moment? It started me down the path of realizing I must put myself beneath the needs of my students. So these things that are very important to us in our adult lives, these aspects and attributes of living a decent life where we feel comfortable. I want to be comfortable. I like to be able to express my preferences. All of these things must be suborned. They have to go beneath the needs of children. And some of the more difficult ones, things like popularity, that's difficult sometimes, particularly for leaders. I've got parents lined up out the door. This is easy in my mind. I'm not saying that you use this language with the parents, but the philosophy is back of the line. Kids first. I'm doing what's right for the children. My father dispenses knowledge as if he is a yogi. I'm not sure he realizes that most of it is aphorisms that he gathered from fortune cookies. But one of the things that he said that did stick, that has always resonated with me, is always do the right thing, son. And it's very rarely going to be the popular thing or the easy thing. The convenience, whatever's easiest for the adult, we do that a lot when we have jobs. But we have to remember that in education we don't have jobs. It's not just a job. We serve children. And so I have to do what's right no matter how inconvenient it might be. Efficiencies and, it's going to cost a little more, and the lowest bidder and things like that, which we'll get into in just a minute. Those things have to take a back seat to what's best for children. The institution of the American public school, and this is both historic and institutional. This is a governmental thing as well as a history thing. But the creation of the history of the American public education system, which I detail ad nauseum in my first book if you're really into that sort of thing, is predicated and built upon. It is literally modeled upon
3 other social institutions. You'll have to forgive the technical difficulty here. I asked the audience what these were, and they rightly came up with them: the factory, the prison, and the church. And while it's shocking, I explained to the audience that this is not merely figurative, but literal. The same architects who designed factories and prisons, for example, were indeed, as Michel Foucault pointed out, creating schools as well. And being a warden sometimes led to being a schoolmaster, and vice versa. Whether we choose to acknowledge it or not, phenomena that are endemic to these 3 foundational institutions do indeed persist in many, if not most, schools today. I continued,
I am not accusing anybody in this room of actively doing this, but I want to raise our consciousness as a group today about the potential for the insidiousness of these 3 institutional qualities to exist within your school. So, when we think of a factory, what are elements of the factory that exist in the institution of the school? Every part that comes out looks exactly alike. The widget phenomenon. One activity fits all. The assembly line. Shout on out. Bells and whistles. Boop, boop, it's lunchtime. Boop, now it's time to go home. You can't get out of your desk yet. You sit there at your sewing machine, desk, until it's time to go. Continue to do your worksheets, sew soccer balls together with your teeth. Stay there and do that thing. The authority figure, the foreman, you do what I tell you to do, and I'm going to sit here quietly over at my desk while you continue to be productive. You hear it all the time. You didn't finish your homework. Who gives a crap about homework? The research shows us that homework is useless. If you're an elementary school teacher, the research unimpeachably shows that there is absolutely no impact on student outcome up through 6th grade. None. 0. Not a good impact, not a bad impact, no impact at all. It matters 0%, but we continue to do it. Why? Productivity. You have to be busy. You have to work. Show your work. I hear that all the time in mathematics, particularly now that we're moving past that into theories like Van der Waals and moving to a more progressive mathematics pedagogy. Thank goodness. But I used to get dinged all the time for not showing my work. The point of learning is not to produce. It's to learn. The factory ideology of production, of manufacturing, of making things and making sure that you're doing it just this way is absurd. That goes against personalized learning. That's not differentiation. It's sure not individualization. I have an ongoing war of words with Rick Wormley about differentiation. I don't like the word differentiation because while it started off as a good idea about meeting individual needs, now it's really back to almost a philosophy of tracking. There's this, and then there's gifted, and then there's woohoo, and that's it. That's differentiation. I've covered all 3 kinds of kid. That's not, no. So I don't use the term differentiation. I talk about individualization. Individualization, meeting the needs of the individual learner and allowing that learner to be idiosyncratic, flies totally in the face of the institutional model of the factory school. Things like the education industry. Please don't use these terms. There's a guy that I work with in my school district who, because this is being recorded, I will not call out by name. But every single meeting we're in, he's talking about customers. Are you kidding me? There are no customers in education. There aren't. Learning is not a commodity. It's not an object. It's not an item. Learning is autogenic. It comes from within the learner and therefore is individually situated within a living, breathing, thinking, feeling human being. That is not something you make. That's something that is created within the individual. The meaning is created within the learner by the learner. That's not a manufacturing phenomenon. I'm not here to please parents, and neither are you. If you are a leader in your building or in your school division, I'm not saying don't listen to our parent partners, but I am saying if we accept children first, parents being adults have to take a back seat to their children's needs. That's one of the hardest things to do. It's one of the hardest things I have to do. I don't want my kid to be exposed to blue light because it's rotting their brain. Okay, First of all, no, it's not. The sun also emits blue spectrum light. I can educate that parent as much as possible. But at the end of the day, I don't want this to happen. If it's the right thing to do, I am perfectly willing to say, I'm sorry, I hear you, but my responsibility is to do the right thing. I challenge everyone to accept that as a philosophy. It is not easy. It is not sometimes safe. I have been fired, as I mentioned, from that first job. Doing right sometimes involves risk. Now, I'm not asking you to throw your career down the toilet. I've obviously gotten better at keeping jobs since that first one, because I am employed, as you will see in one of the slides in a moment. But I am asking you to consider your priorities. The idea of, we put out a community satisfaction survey. If my children are thriving and all of their needs are met and it doesn't please people, I don't care. My role is not to be a people pleaser. It is to meet the needs of children. And the craft of teaching is far too complex, far too important, far too high an ethical imperative to be secondary to some moron layperson's whims. It isn't fair to children. And if I ever hear about workplace readiness, I'm going to throw something through the window. Preparing children for the future does not presuppose a workplace or a college. It makes no such presuppositions. If we're going to be the futurists we know we need to be, and as looking at this room, this sea full of brilliant educational technology leaders, I know you know that. So put that into practice. We don't talk about, my superintendent used a phrase several years ago that he has thankfully dropped, the pre-K 16 continuum. Also known as the assembly line, as far as I can tell, that you have a starting point and all children will go to this end point. That's not personalizing. That isn't making sure we meet their needs. I want my children to be future ready, but I'm not going to predicate that readiness upon a workplace. That doesn't make any sense. If I hear one more person talk about branding, I am so sick and tired of teach like a pirate. I'm going to say it. I'm sorry, Dave Burgess, you're a great guy, but if I see one more bandana and one more hoop earring, I'm too busy doing the job to dress up and do a costume. Now, if that's your jam, that's fine, but I don't want any professional development in my school talking about this. Yes, we're the Discovery Explorers at my school, and we have a mascot, and we have a logo, but we don't use that to advance the cause of the adult. We use that to stimulate interest for our children and help them have an identity. But I'm not really good at, maybe a lot of you haven't read any of my books. I don't hawk my wares. I do the work. And I'm exhausted by this idea that we need to spend time worrying about branding. We just won this big, communications national award. Who cares? We're good communicators, great. But I'm not going to build all of my structures around winning the Baldrige Award. I'm not here to put mantles on the shelf. Let's do the job. There are no customers. Customer satisfaction is not what we do. And productivity has got to get out. This is the biggest thing of the factory, is the idea that we have to produce in order to show that we have learned. No, you don't. You don't. In my first book, I talk about omnimodal assessment, that all forms of assessment are valid. If you ask one of your learners, if you go back to your classroom tomorrow and walk up to one of your learners and you say, show me that you understand whatever it is, the number of ways they could do that is infinite. It doesn't matter if it makes something. Maybe they'll tell you. Maybe they'll show you. Maybe they'll build something. I don't know. It might be productive, but productivity is not requisite for learning. Every time we use business language, every time we go down this road and we try to synergize ourselves with other industries, we are failing our calling. We are not like other industries because we are not an industry. The craft of teaching, the art and science of pedagogy, and the work of meeting the needs of every child is not a business, it is not a job, it is not an industry, it is a calling higher than any other. We are the calling that creates all other callings. And yes, I want you to be that kind of person when you think about teaching and learning. It is that special. It is a privilege to serve children. It is not an industry, and we must not allow the creep of those who wish to profit off of them and off of us to insidiously sneak into our schools and classrooms. They have no place there. When it comes to the prison, this may depend on your jurisdiction, but the underlying institutional premises are still there, right? So a phrase that I use with my teachers all the time is teachers never punish. Punishment never works. Punishment is stupid. We don't punish, we teach. If you use the responsive classroom model, you know that's central to the idea, is we take the moment to teach. You cannot expect a third grader to be successful and navigate some of these incredibly complex social institutions and phenomena unless we teach them how to do that. And we do not assume that they are getting all of those needs met and learning everything that they need to do in any given environment. Some of you were probably fortunate enough to teach in communities where the vast majority of your families are really great partners, and they're helpful, and they really care about their kids. That's great. That's not what every community looks like.
Sorry again, just one more technical difficulty. I told the audience here that I understand that some of them may teach in communities that don't necessarily have profoundly loving homes. And when I say that, I don't mean destitute. Some of the most supportive families I've ever seen are among the poorest, and having a solid roof and plenty of food and a wealthy set of parents does not automatically translate to love and nurturing. We talked about how punishing children is always wrong for teachers. It always fails. Our job is not to imprison or shame or harm or control. It is to teach. Our work is teaching, and teaching cedes control to the learner if it is philosophically and pedagogically truly pro-child. We then talked about the institution of the church, and this topic sometimes gets taken out of context, hence the Monty Python opening credits style disclaimer. I prefaced saying that in no way was I commenting on matters of belief or faith, but rather discussing the institutional qualities of the church that exist in the institution of the school. These include being strictly hierarchical, male-dominated, authoritarian, as in the ultimate authority cannot be questioned and in many cases is infallible, even when scrutinized with Enlightenment-era thinking or logic or dialectic. The church institution is clergy-rich. Superintendents are like popes, directors cardinals, and principals are practically the archbishops of their own scholastic diocese, often lauded more for maintaining the principles of the institution than for ministering to and serving the poorest and the weakest, for tending to their flock. Now, I know that this is hard for leaders to hear, and I told the audience that, but one has to be humble enough to recognize the problems we face if we're to fix them. We must recognize the failures of the institution if we are to subvert it, and we do need to subvert it. And finally, one of the most essential qualities of the institution of the church that persists in the institution of the school is that it is everlasting. It is unchanging. It does not bend, it survives the changes of society, and in fact looks down on society changing, willfully, defiantly remaining the same, as it was, as it is now, as it ever shall be, forever and ever, school without end. Oy vey. I continued.
That attribute is something that we see in action in schools all the time. When I was a kid, I had a great time at my school doing, okay, I don't care. That's not of any interest to me. I don't want to create the church of 1970 or 1870 or 1770 or 1670. I need the school to be responsive to the needs of these children today. And as a consequence, the aspect of everlasting has to go out. And hierarchy doesn't help make that happen. The creation of shame, if you're not familiar with Alice Miller's work, welcome, now you are familiar with Alice Miller's work. All forms of shame are processed by the child brain as trauma. It is almost as bad to physically strike a child as it is to shame them. It is experienced by the developing child brain as trauma. It is never a good thing to shame a child, but many aspects of traditional behavior management in schools are predicated upon those things, being good. And there's good and there's bad and there's binary and there's hierarchy. That's not helpful. The idea of niceness. Sometimes niceness is not an appropriate response. If somebody is being cruel to you, we teach, for example, within the responsive classroom model, we teach assertion. I can't learn when you're hitting me with that pencil. I need you to stop. Well, that's not very nice. I don't care. Stop freaking hitting me with the pencil. We are allowed to assert ourselves as autonomous individuals. That's appropriate. And to say, oh, just sit there and be quiet, is not an appropriate lesson to teach a child. So we need to get these things out of here. Obedience is not necessary. When that teacher said to that kid in my first example, go put your coat on. No, I'm not cold. What's wrong with that? Well, he talked back to the teacher. Who cares? Is your ego so fragile? Is your self-worth so low that oppressing children is the only way that you can get through your day? I don't believe that about anybody in this room, but I bet you if you think about it, you know somebody who's just like that. I certainly do. So these three institutions that predicate lead to the idea of the old school, institution-centered school. So now that we've talked about all the horror show, let's get away from it. The institution is not worth defending. We're here to talk about children and put them first, to put them centered. I teach at arguably, if not the most, one of the most important elementary schools in the world. Discovery Elementary School is and I have to make sure that I put it on the website like in couched language. At this very moment, it is the world's largest zero-energy elementary school. We have hydroponic gardens on the inside. We grow our own food. We serve it in the kitchen. We have sustainability culture and lessons throughout absolutely every element of our instruction or curriculum. Yes, there is a big curly slide right in the middle of the school. We do not have any desks. We have tons of beanbags. We allow children in the hallways. We teach in the hallways. We do not have rules. We have expectations. No number grades, no letter grades at any point ever. 4 copiers, no worksheets at any point ever. Beautiful. The building doesn't matter. I use it as a teaching tool. I help my teachers use it as a teaching tool. But the work that we do to look at being child-centered and to put those practices into... If you teach in the worst brick box with no lights and no windows in a musty, dusty, crappy old place, not only do I know that you can teach the way that you need to teach in that environment, I can safely say I've done that because that first job was in a big old brick box. I know that it can be done. The building doesn't make the school, you do. Your practices, and when you go back to your school, you will be able to keep these things in mind and change your practices and uplift the central element of child needs meeting and start to turn the things back towards those outer rings and push some of the adult concerns a little further away and get refocused on students at the center. People love their frameworks and their infographics. Boy, let me tell you what. Did you know that the SAMR model is not only not research-based, but was not created by an educator? SAMR sucks. Stop using it. And if you're an ed tech director, stop doing it right now. It doesn't make any sense because it's not evidence-based. Why would you do something that isn't evidence-based? Children's lives are at stake here. Throw it out. My current assistant superintendent of instruction just loves the TIM, the technology integration matrix. Fine, whatever. Matrices, boxes, the craft, the work, the effort on the ground is vastly more important than the framework. And I don't give a crap if a teacher is not at redefinition if they're doing the work. We'll work on the professional development in the long term. What I want us to refocus on is teaching the individual child and meeting their needs. And these vehicles don't really have anything to do with that. I'm not saying they don't have use. A lug wrench has utility, but it doesn't make for a great car. It's one tool. You cannot build pedagogy around something that is not evidence-based and not created by or for teaching. It doesn't make any sense. There are better priorities to put up front, like this one. I cannot believe how frequently I reference Maslow, and how many of you have not really seen or heard or talked about this since Ed Psych 101, right? This goes all the way back, but I'm telling you, if you refocus on child needs and you start putting this back at the center, use this instead of SAMR, use this instead of TIM, use this instead of the other frameworks that you may be using. Start with child needs and watch what happens. Now, this is just one illustration. Maslow himself wrote that there are many different ways to interpret this. And one of the most commonly misunderstood phenomenon around Maslow is Maslow never said, you must check all of these boxes, every one of them, before any of these are possible. Without air or water, there is no personal security. He never said that, right? But the more needs we meet at the baser levels, the easier it is for the individual to attain those in the upper level. And most of the levels down here, children, especially young children, are dependent on us for help. The bootstrapping mentality of do-it-yourself is inhumane to little kids. They need nurturing and love. They need support and care. You cannot abandon children into toughness and expect them to thrive. We must meet their needs. That's what we do. Yes, there are people who don't believe that. They're not us. They're not part of our crew. So consider for a moment, we went to this first example. I hear this all the time since I've moved. I've been living in the South now for 16 years or so, and it's very, very different place, climate-wise, than where I'm from. I'm from almost near Canada. Again, it snows like 9 months out of the year. Syracuse, New York is the snowiest city in the contiguous United States. So the way that we operate with clothing and HVAC is very different than here. So rather than you always have to have a hat and coat on, down here it's no hats and no coats. Take that hat off in that classroom. Why? Why? There's no good reason for it. If the kid wants to regulate their temperature by changing what gets out of their head, temperature-wise, who cares? Why does that matter? No coats. Well, I don't know what you got on under there. You don't know what they have under the rest of the stuff either. Right? The nonsense narrative from 1999 was that Dylan and what's-his-face, the morons that did Columbine, wore the trench coats to conceal their weapons. It isn't true. Law enforcement used that as a narrative to get you to change your behaviors, but it isn't based on evidence. They didn't do that. It isn't true. Look it up. So no hats and coats. Why? If a kid is sitting there just freezing, how can you expect them to learn if they're not comfortable, if they're not safe, if they don't have their needs met? That's a biological need, the ability to self-regulate one's own body. So for me as a band director, my need in the classroom is I needed to be able to make eye contact with my students, because I cannot do my work if I go to get trumpet and their brim. So what's the logical solution? Instead of no hats, turn it around. The first time I said that to my class, I was like, hey dude, can you turn your hat around for me? He was like, what? I was like, turn your hat around. I need to be able to see your eyes. The school's still here. And he came up afterwards, he's like, can I wear my hat in class? I was like, why on earth would I not let you wear a hat? What do I care? What does that have to do with what we just did? Darn right. The sanitary elimination of waste is a global crisis. We need people to have sanitation. To deny your children access to the clean and sanitary restrooms in your school as a behavior control mechanism is brutality. It is inappropriate. Don't ever do it again. Ever. It is not appropriate. The scarring and shaming and psychological phenomenon that I have seen in children who have been systematically denied the right to safely eliminate waste is catastrophic to child development. Don't ever do it again. There is no piece of evidence on earth that says that it's acceptable. Well, they might miss something. So they miss something. Catch them up. Or better yet, design a learning opportunity that doesn't require the factory model for everybody to be sitting there exactly in the same place doing exactly the same thing for that exact second. Record it, for crying out loud. You're ed tech people. There are so many options that are better than this. This is down here, man. This is down here. I want you to remember that. Don't worry about the Sammer model and the Tim network next time you're thinking about behavior. You're denying basic physiological needs to little kids. That's crazy pants. Don't do it. It doesn't make any sense. We have to change our behaviors away from these old restrictive and outmoded models. It might have made sense way back in the day. I don't know. I don't think so. There's no research that supports it now. There wasn't then. But that control mechanism of, I will control your body. This is kind of a big deal in society right now. I am the commander of your body, and I'll tell you what you can and cannot do with it. No. Their needs before your needs. No. Free and reduced lunch. We're getting into policy craft now. Why free and reduced lunch? What would be better? Lunch. Exactly. Biological needs. No snacks in the classroom. What are you kidding me? You know the kids in your classrooms. I know you remember them. There's not a teacher I've ever met that didn't remember the hungry child. And sometimes it's just because they go, okay, that's fine. Their metabolism is different than mine. That's fine. But there are kids who need to eat. We must provide those needs. So when the kids are walking down the hallway and they go by the hydroponic garden and they pull off a strawberry and they eat it, we don't say nothing. It's a strawberry. It'll grow. That's literally what it's here for, is to grow more strawberries. I might go up and ask, like, hey, man, you like that? Was it good? You want to participate? Maybe you can help us grow more. Can I have that? Of course you can. Eat. You're a human. You're a growing human. It's way down here. But this has a huge ramification for some of our policy craft. When we look at our master's schedule, one of the first things, not one of the last things, one of the first things we do, everyone has their full 35-minute lunch period. You don't think that teachers are like, well, they can chow down in 20. That 15 minutes goes a long way for literacy remediation. It's down here. That goes first. Literacy remediation is not going to happen if there ain't no food. We're going to do that first. And then free play and recess, unstructured free play and recess. Our kids get more than the minimum requirement that APS mandates. That's a lot of time we're burning that I could use for OG or for an intervention. Needs first. That has to come first. And if it makes it more difficult, I ask my staff all the time, is that an adult problem or a child problem? That's an adult problem. We can fix it. Let's make sure that our teaching practices keep up so that we do not betray our cause in meeting the needs of kids. Now, one of my favorite things to kind of come back fuller circle to. Research shows, and again, you don't stand on a stage like this being recorded and say things that people can't Google. So do Google and look it up if you're like, I don't think so. It's uncomfortable. Letter grades and number grades are useless and do not help children. And in some cases, they are really bad for kids. And I'm going to give you my perfect example why. And anybody from Yorktown who's listening will remember that I've said this before, including to the previous boss. This is something that I will go on record as saying. At Yorktown High School, like 44 valedictorians, something like that. Like 43, 44 valedictorians. And you can hear the parent conversation in your head that tells you everything you need to know about how arbitrary and nonsensical grades are. My child outperformed all those kids and got a 4.34. That makes him top. The number is the top number. It is the highest number, and therefore he's the valedictorian. And a mom goes in and goes, my kid got 4.35. And she goes, they're really close. The distinction is all that important? Does it really matter? Goes from being the most ardent defender of the math to being like, isn't it kind of arbitrary? Can't we have multiple valedictorians? First of all, why do you have a valedictorian at all? Grade point average has nothing to do with performance, and anybody who's ever been through high school will tell you that. How can I get my extra credit? Teachers who like you and who don't. You got a hard teacher, you get an easy teacher. You get a schedule, you didn't. You did extracurricular activities, you didn't. You were always good at this subject, you weren't. There are infinite variables that go into this. But at the end of the day, any numerical distinction around skill mastery is arbitrary. A B plus at one school does not mean the same thing as a B plus at another. We know this to be true. The problem therein lies not with, well, we need to standardize then to make sure that B plus means the same. B plus doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. The research around, I'm most, again, familiar with elementary level research, but the research at elementary shows us that there are really only two grades. Can anybody guess what the child perception of those two grades is? Pass and fail is a good example. If you use elementary language, good or bad? What's good? A. What's bad? Everything else. It doesn't make any sense. So in our standards-based assessment model, we did away with all distinctions. The only distinction, and the only reason we use that distinction at all, is because we're required to have a distinction because Virginia says so. We have meets standard and developing mastery. That's it. Well, how do I know how my kid is doing? Lots of additional data, primarily the narrative. Better yet, call me, and I'll tell you. Anytime you want, have a conversation with the teacher. I do not make my teachers do letter grades or number grades. I insist that they do not use them because the research does not show us that it benefits student learning. It is an archetype, it is a throwback to institutionalism that does not have a place if we're truly meeting the needs of the learner. They need specific feedback. They need specific, responsive, adaptive feedback, and we have tools to do that. We have our words, first of all, but we also have computer adaptive apps that allow us to get instantaneous feedback in a non-judgmental way. I find apps all the time that use no percentages. I like kids to practice their fact fluency, so sometimes I use tiny cards because it's just a progress bar and doesn't have a percentage attached to it because I don't want them in a productivity mindset. But no part of our assessment talks about the essential judgment, going back to some of the institutions down here, the idea of goodness and badness, or there-ness and not there-ness. Everything is a journey. If you take a child who starts at 60 and ends at 80, but they go 60, 60, 60, 60, 75, 85, starts at 60, ends at 85, sorry, that's the numbers. And you take a child who goes 60, 85, 85, 85, 85. In traditional systems, child 1 gets a D and child 2 gets a B+, even though they started and ended in exactly the same place in terms of mastery. Why would you punish a child for their individual journey? It don't make no sense. Don't do it. We've got to get away from that, because that starts to insinuate itself into these spaces where we get this idea of judgment and goodness and badness. We don't want that. We want students to continue to work to get their needs met. Now, my role today is not to outline how to implement that framework, how to implement that pedagogy. I'm happy to do that. I come to schools and do that all the time. And if you've heard some of my other work or read any of my stuff, that's the work. What I want you to consider is broadly how these needs, looking at a Maslow hierarchy, thinking about meeting the needs of children, can help resituate them at the center of our practice. In your classrooms, every day, your children have a right to thrive. They have a right to clean air. So every sensor at Discovery has a CO2 sensor, and once it reaches 900 parts per billion, which is what research shows us starts to impact cognition, we blow fresh oxygen into the room. I know that you don't have that. Get a fan. If it's stuffy and you're having difficulty and you're feeling groggy, so are your kids. Help them out. Have water available. Have food if you need it. Make sure you insist on sleep. Do away with homework. More time for sleep. Sleep is critically important for child development. Kids at the elementary age need 10, 11, 12 hours of sleep a day. They can't get that if they're burdened with nonsense productivity. Teach during the day. Play, eat, sleep, family at night. Free up that time. If you need to have a couple of extra pieces of clothing for kids that are cold, have it. It doesn't cost much. Go to Lost and Found. They're going to throw it away at the end of the year. Donate it anyway. Grab a couple. Stick them in the closet. Why not? Never use the bathroom as a weapon against your children. They need your guidance. They need to be kept within the rails. I understand that. One of the analogies that I use in my first book is Mama Bear and Cub. Cub will go over and look right up the thing. And Mama stands there. She knows. It's okay. You can look. Doesn't hurt to look. Kids go, no. There you go. We need to be Mama Bears. That's actually it was a nickname of mine at one of my old schools. They're like, you are such a Mama Bear. Because I'm always going up and making sure the kids are getting their needs met. If a kid's experimenting or looking at something or exploring with something or doing something that maybe it's not exactly good, if it's not hurting them, let them explore a little bit. What's it going to hurt? It doesn't. A little doodle never killed anybody. A little looking at a door never hurt anybody. There was a maintenance room door that was ajar the other day, and the kid walked over and he opened the door and he just stood there looking. Fascinated. For like 2 minutes. And I noticed it because it was right outside my office, and I was like, hey buddy, what are you looking at? He's like, what does all this do? So I taught him. That's way better than like, close that door and go back to class. Come on, I'm a teacher. Teach the kid. Allow them to explore, but make sure that we're secure. I'm responsible for school safety and security at my school, so we pay a lot of attention to this. I put a level 2 trauma kit in every one of my classrooms. It's not just Band-Aids. It's all sorts of stuff, because you never know. Why not? Adult problem or child problem? That's an adult problem. We can fix that. Providing resources and having one's own sense of property. I really try to avoid taking things away from children. And when I do, if I have to, for their safety, for their security, I make sure to articulate, I know that this is yours. I'm going to hang on to this for a little while. I am going to return this to you. Don't keep things overnight if they're not yours. To develop a sense of one's own property, that's how low on the hierarchy this is. That's a safety need. You need to develop a sense of your own property, to have your own things, to be in control of your own body. Those things are very low on the hierarchy, so keep that in mind. Love is not a word we use nearly often enough. I recognize that there are concerns in the world. I am not going to kick a second grader off my leg when they come to give me a hug. The authentic experience of love is a critical developmental need for every child, and I'm telling you folks, too many of them are not getting it at home. I am always going to create a condition of love. I will never shy away from telling a child that I love them. I will never shy away from an opportunity to show them that they are a valid, individual human being, innately deserving of dignity and respect and love. Being able to provide those connections is essential to our work, regardless of what level you're on. But particularly at the high school level, sometimes this doesn't always come through. Let's be mindful of the criticality of not the artifice of love. It's not just the enacting of affection. It's developing the authentic love for each child. The kid that drives you the most crazy is the kid you need to work on with yourself the hardest, not them. Children have to have the power to choose, and when the phrase self-esteem, I mean, I've heard it a bajillion times. We certainly heard this a lot when I was a kid. But what are we really talking about? Autonomy, self-determination. And it is never too early to set a child free from the oppressive forces of the institutions I talked about earlier. A kindergartner is an autonomous human being. They do not come out as a blank slate, as Rousseau called it the tabula rasa, as Freire called it, the banking vault for banking pedagogy. None of it is true. Children immediately upon birth have capability right from the start, and they have autonomy. They are deserving of dignity. They deserve your respect, and they deserve freedom. Allow them choice. Sometimes it doesn't take much, but keeping children devoid of choice will not help them to make good choices. To be a teacher, we must allow them freedom. And finally, if we're ever going to have self-actualizing children, they need to have not only the knowledge of themselves, all learning is autogenic. All learning comes from within the learner. It cannot be imposed. So when I talk about dismantling the extrinsic motivation system, because the research shows us that it's not good for kids, the first rejoinder is always, well, then how are my kids going to be motivated? We are all intrinsically motivated. That's our natural condition. Left to our own devices, we may not choose to do things. I didn't choose algebra, let me tell you. But nobody made it relevant to me, and that wasn't my fault. Nobody made algebra relevant to me. It wasn't my fault. I was a little kid. That was my teacher's fault. She never bothered to recognize that me just going through the motions of productivity was not stimulating me to learn. You know when I learned algebra? When I wanted to equip a better shield playing EverQuest 2. I learned algebra to be better at video games. Your kids are playing Fortnite. Enough said. Use what they have in their lives. Go to where they are, and we will have a far better achievement than if we impose our adult feelings upon them. I leave you with this. It is not enough to have it in theory. We talked broadly today about these needs. It's a simple concept. The simple concept of putting every individual child's needs at the center of everything you do. But it has to be put into practice. It must be praxis. You have to do it, and it's hard, and it's tiring. I promise you this, I've said it to many keynote audiences before. If you are ever at your rope's end and you don't have anybody else to call, you go on my website, you call me. Call me in my office, call me on my cell phone. I will talk you back through it. That's what I had to do. I had to call my friends when I was rock bottom. I can't do this anymore, man. I thought I was good enough. I just can't. It's killing me. I'm not sleeping, I'm not eating, I'm exhausted. I just can't do this anymore. Just constantly it would come back. Dude, I know it's hard, but I've never known anybody who loves children more than you do. They need you. Sometimes that's enough. If it's not, I'll find what it is. I promise. Every individual child, not children broadly, every individual at the center of everything we do, every minute of every day. Now, it's not always easy to think about how that might look, but that's why I said at the top that imagination is an absolute prerequisite to be a great teacher and to be a teacher leader. And anybody who works in ed tech, who comes to an ed tech conference on a Monday morning, has imagination. I know that you do. The question is, are you going to use it for good or not? I left you with my premises. We talked about how children are more important than we are and that learning must supersede the school. When you go back to your school, that is the place, but the work is learning, because we always put students first so that they can learn forever. Thank you.